Why are there feminists?
So that's Lee Waaks asking the first question of the podcast. Why are there feminists? To answer the question, and many like it, Lee has invited Philip Carl Salzman, anthropologist from McGill University, to enlighten us. This is the LocoFoco Netcast, and this is the first episode of the second season. My name is Timothy Virkkala, and here is Lee.
My first question for you, Philip, is kind of an odd one, but it's why are there feminists? Can we explain that? I mean, do they have a legitimate gripe? What's your perspective on that?
Well, you start off with a very difficult question.
I think it is a difficult one, so I apologize, but take a crack at it anyway.
And this is Professor Salzman, anthropologist from McGill University.
Well, I think that it's part of human culture to take partisan positions. For example, in tribal society is based on the idea that you are part of a kin group and you are opposed to other kin groups. Anthropologists call this balanced opposition, there's a very strong moral obligation that you support your kinsmen in opposition to anybody else. It's really the number one social morality of tribal society. Now we have partisanship in our society. We see it clearly in politics. We have parties that are designed to represent the interests, to represent the values and perspectives of certain values and perspectives, and there's a kind of partisanship where people identify with one or another party and proceed on those grounds, and that partisanship comes into other relationships and affects the way social life goes.
So women are just part of a tribe, or at least feminists are a part of a tribe of sorts, a fraction of women who are sticking up for themselves in a partisan sort of way. Is that what you're saying?
No, I wouldn't. I would prefer to use the idea of tribe in a very technical way, not use it as a metaphor for everything. I think that what has happened is that women's partisanship has been activated by the adoption of a Marxist vision of society. In North America, we have had in the past a liberal vision of society, of individuals voluntarily associating, working together, cooperating, competing in order to build families, communities, businesses, voluntary groups, parties, and so on. So there was a focus on individuals rather than on categories of people. And of the choices that people made, and of free association and freedom of choice within associations. The Marxist vision is quite different. The Marxist vision, which became popular during the counterculture in the 1960s and was adopted in universities in the 1970s, sees society as broken into a hierarchy of classes in which the upper class suppresses, oppresses, and exploits the lower classes for its own benefit.
Right. But why do you think women, some women anyway, obviously it's a minority of women, why do you think they're attracted to that Marxist vision and now have fused it together with this feminist ideology? Do we have any clue as to why that might be?
Well, part of this vision is that the people in the lower classes are victims. And I think that certainly in the past, women's rights have been restricted and women's status has been disparaged by the general culture. That changed, I think, during and after the war, the World War II. It was a gradual thing through the 20th century, and increasingly women gained more recognition, more rights, more opportunities, and the idea that men were superior to women, I think, was eroded away. But the more opportunities women received and the more privileges they got, the more they felt that somehow they'd been cheated in the past and were being cheated now. And the Marxist model told them that they were being oppressed. And it's cultural Marxism because they weren't talking about economic classes. They were talking about sex classes. The patriarchy, consisting of all men, oppressed and exploited all women and abused them. This was a model that they adopted in order to advance themselves. They were now in a much better position to advance themselves because they had received more or less equal rights in the law and opportunities in the wider social world and economic world.
Right.
And so the stronger their position, the more they felt they could push for greater advantage. And I think you're right to identify feminism with partisanship. Although during the 1960s, when it was still called the women's movement, they talked about equality. But that went by the board fairly quickly. And it's indicative that they picked the name feminism, which obviously indicates partisanship, women against men.
But many feminists are men. So it's obviously a position that almost anyone can hold. Apparently people now who don't pretend to be men or women. So is that a strange development in itself?
Well, I think it's very interesting. I think that it's also coincident with the widespread adoption of the Marxist model of society. I'm guessing most of those men went to universities and were taught the Marxist model of society. And so they do accept that women are victims and were exploited and are exploited and are deserve all kinds of recompense for what happened in the past and what they claim is still happening now. And I think you get similar kind of support. Cultural Marxism doesn't stop there, because exactly the same model was adopted by homosexuals, by the LGBTQ people, who argue that they're victims of heterosexual oppression, heteronormality, and that they claim they have a right to claim special consideration on those grounds. And of course, most notably, as has been most prominent this year, that same model was adopted for race, and with whites oppressing people of color, exploiting them, holding them down, making them into victims, and the partisanship has become so great this year that it led to riots, looting, arson, assault, murder, and it goes on. So that partisanship, so you have sex partisanship, sexuality partisanship, racial partisanship. It's amazing even more blood doesn't flow in the streets the way things are these days.
But sticking with feminism in particular, do you think that men thought of themselves as superior to women in the past, say going back 75, 100 years? I'm not sure where we want the cutoff to be, but do you think that was the case and that women had legitimate gripes? I mean, of course, you can say, oh, they didn't have the right to vote, but as someone pointed out, I've forgotten where I read this, most men didn't have the right to vote either.
Until the 19th century. Right.
So, I mean, can we chalk all of this up to the division of labor, a sort of path dependency of sorts built around biology, or do women actually have a legitimate gripe?
Look, I don't know how many men felt that they were superior to women, or whether they felt that men and women were different. I think there's a lot of evidence that men and women are different. The sexual division of labor suggests that both men and women are necessary. Both men and women have to collaborate. And I don't think that was lost on most men. You have to keep in mind that prior to the Industrial Revolution, most economic production was subsistence oriented, and the working unit of production was the family. Men and women worked together in order to produce what they needed in order to survive. And I've lived in subsistence societies, and asking who is more important, it's not a question that would make any sense in those societies.
Right. My friend David McDonough, who passed away this year, a philosopher of sort, he said that feminists are basically anti-feminist in a sense, given the fact that most women are not feminists who do seek out typical relationships with men and want a family life. And they may not, of course, want to spend their time darning socks, as some of them did in the old days, but they recognize a sort of division of labor. It may be a lot fairer now, but they're not particularly feminist in orientation. So do you think we can call feminists essentially anti-feminists, as he claimed? I mean, it's meant to be ironic, obviously, and sort of a joke in a sense, but it seems to have some truth to it. Do you think so?
Well, I think that there are many things that feminists say that don't correspond very well with reality. And I would rather say that feminists are anti-truth rather than anti-female. They see themselves as pro-female and as benefiting other women. And I think, in fact, one of the reasons that different waves of feminism have changed is that successes in early waves of feminism have released women from having to engage in partisanship, and subsequent waves of feminism have tried to find new ways of engaging women in this partisan effort.
I see. The average IQ is around 100, and it's the same for women. Men and women apparently are approximately equal in terms of IQ, and there might be some slight differences depending on the subtests, right? Like men might be better in terms of visual spatial abilities and so forth. But and women might have better verbal abilities. But putting that aside, does feminism really do anything for the average woman, given that most of them are just simply average? They're not going to rise to the top of a major corporation. They might be a cashier at Walmart, for example. Does it even benefit? I know that it benefits some women in the sense that it has cleared a path, broken open the glass ceiling in some respects, but it seems like it's a movement for upper class women.
I think whatever has happened, feminists have worked at whatever level to get more benefits for females at the expense of males. And we see that in the education system. We see that in hiring. The whole idea of diversity pushed by females requires that they never be in a minority in any institution or organization or activity. And yet, when women dominate, that's not a problem. They see it. Men are not there, but they can have as much as they want. If you look at, for example, one of the places that they've pushed is in higher education. They want more women in. They want more women gaining educational credentials. If you look at U.S. college degrees by gender, class of 2020, if you look at all degrees, this is associates, bachelors, masters, and doctors, 58.6 of the U.S. college degrees went to females, 41% to males. So for every 100 males, there were 142 females who got degrees. Now, that was not true when I was in college. When I was in college and when I went to graduate school, more degrees went to males. So there's been a flip. And that's a flip that feminists have been working for, to give women the advantage over men. And they've received it. The fact that they dominate now is they do not see that as a problem. They see that as a success. So this isn't about fairness. It isn't about equality. This is about female advantage.
Earlier you mentioned the 60s and 70s kind of women's lib version of feminism. which is what I grew up with. That was the idea that I had. And so last night I put down a list of things that I would consider personal liberation. It wasn't about equality. It was about everybody gaining their advantage to live in the society in a nice way. And so women got legal protections for independent action. That's one of the things that happened in the last 200 years, is that they got back up to do all sorts of things, and the customs for that. But we all got home conveniences, which liberated women from drudgery in the home, which is where much of women's work was, right? And that was that. Public education and subsidized professional daycare have helped women, because women do give birth and they are the primary caregivers. So when you outsource that liberates them in some sense. So there's a whole list of things that have liberated women, and women point to that often, even unto this day, even as they try to gain advantages. How does that square now with modern feminism? You're sort of suggesting that women are trying to gain advantage over men, and some of these advantages seem to be gaining both of them, but it seems often, like in the case of public education and state aid to women with children, it's no longer women cooperating with men to make a family. They're women getting money from the state or getting advantages through the state and state action. And so instead of men and women cooperating individually, now men and women are cooperating through the state. Tax funneling of wealth and so forth. Is this a major factor, is state programs?
Well, I would say that they're not so much cooperating through the state, they're competing with each other under state aegis, and the females are winning and the males are losing under the labels of diversity, equity, and inclusion. For example, even though females dominate almost every sector of university, the ones that they don't yet dominate, they now insist that there be at least equal numbers of. So women are minority in engineering and various natural sciences, and they insist that this is a reflection of discrimination against females, so they want forced entry of females. In fact, the information that we have quite systematic information on what women choose. And women, even highly qualified in mathematics, for example, choose to go into the humanities and social sciences. The reason that there aren't more women in engineering and the sciences is that they choose not to go into them. And this comes back to Lee's point about the differences between men and women. We have quite systematic information, not just in North America, but around the world, that women are more interested in people and men are more interested in things. Women are more skilled in social relations. Men are more skilled in spatial material activities. These are irrefutable understandings of science. So this idea that science departments, engineering departments must be forced to have demographic parity between males and females is simply an ideological imposition that goes beyond what people actually choose when they're free to choose. And when on the grounds that of discrimination that does not in fact exist.
And that's Bjorn out. See, I'm working a pun in there. Bjorn out in Sweden, what you just said. Bjorn out. See, anyway, that was bad.
That's quite a pun there, Lee. Yeah. Okay.
We
can edit that out. Anyway.
Yes, Bjorn out in Sweden because in those societies, according to studies, in those societies that are more egalitarian, fewer females choose science and engineering than in not only in other societies that are less egalitarian, but in third world societies where more women go into science.
Now, politically, you identified yourself as a classical liberal. And I'm wondering, in terms of equal opportunity, whether or not a classical liberal society would simply allow men and women to adhere to freedom of association. So, for example, if you started a law firm and you decided for some quirky reason, who knows, I mean, you could say misogynistic reasons if you like, but decided that you wanted your law firm to be all male, I think classical liberal framework would allow for that. So I'm wondering, are women fearful that if we adopted a more libertarian, classical liberal approach, that men would be in a position to basically push them, not out of society, well, push them back into the home in a sense? I wonder if that's part of their concern. And maybe that's why they sort of run away from the classical liberal framework and adopt the Marxist framework.
Well, yeah, I think they're way past that. All classical liberals, of course, as you know, are not libertarians.
Right.
But I have to say that my first discussions of this question of men and women when I was in college, I guess, really was a reaction to some of my elder generation's ideas of the correct place of males and females. There was a double standard, certainly about sex, but there was a double standard, and I found it very offensive. To me, it just wasn't fair that men and women should be treated as equal. That seemed to me the most basic fairness. And so I was I was put off by these expressions of double standards, and I pushed back. I pushed back on them. On the other hand, that's one of the reasons why I feel offended by feminism, because it too vitiates the standard of fairness, of equality, of justice for individuals. Again, in the Marxist view, individuals don't count. Only categories of people count. So that's, to me, a great violation of individual autonomy and freedom.
Aha, we got there. We're halfway through the podcast, and Professor Salzman has made a point about freedom, and this podcast is centered on the idea of freedom. LocoFoco, I should remind the audience, comes from the 1830s and the LocoFoco movement in American politics. This was a hugely important moment in American politics in which libertarianism itself emerged for the first time in a kind of pristine form, and it emerged in the Democratic Party in New York City. And the reason for the LocoFoco name comes from the particularities of that history, and that's very interesting, and you should go back to the backlog, my first interview with Anthony Comegna, where he explains all that. Please go look at that episode with Anthony Comegna, a historian who has researched the LocoFoco movement a great deal. And I should mention also that, since we're in the middle of this episode, we should explain what's going on here. It's been quite a while since I made a podcast of any sort, And so I'm calling this the beginning of the second season, and we'll see if we can maintain a great deal more consistency than in the past. With that said, let's go back to Lee, who's going to talk about what he's been thinking about recently.
So, I was going to mention something that occurred to me a couple of months ago. I was thinking about, I'm not sure why, but the television show The Honeymooners and I Love Lucy. And I think, Philip, you're almost old enough to remember those shows, right?
Yeah, when I was a kid.
Right. So if you recall on those shows, the men were henpecked. At least, well, on I Love Lucy, there was a couple, Fred and Ethel, and Fred was mercilessly henpecked by his wife, Ethel. And on The Honeymooners, Alice was quite disrespectful to her husband, Ralph, the bus driver. And it occurred to me, after thinking about that for a second or two, that if men were dominant and regarded women as inferior, it seems odd that they would get so much guff from their wives, and that would be depicted as a normal couple on television, where a woman essentially runs a man down in some ways. What does that suggest to you in terms of male-female relationships? And
that suggests to me that feminism is abstract ideology divorced from reality.
Mm-hmm.
Let me give you a different example. I did ethnographic field research on the island of Sardinia in the Western Mediterranean. And my wife and I did research together. She was working on gender. And she interviewed a lot of young Sardinian women and asked them what relations were like between men and women in her community. And they all said, "Oh, yes, well, men controlled everything. Women did nothing. Women had nothing. They were totally dependent on men, and so on." And then my wife would ask, "Okay, tell me about your family. Who was in charge of your family?" They would say, "Oh, my grandmother was in charge. She was the one that decided all the major things. She was the one that held the purse. She was the one that dealt with officials." These women imbibe this through television, through school, through newspapers, this feminist vision of what society was like. But if you pin them down as to what their actual family was like, it didn't correspond to that at all.
Right.
Doesn't this suggest an age-old game that men and women play? The game of superiority by sex, and that there are many levels of comedy involved here. That this has always been the case. I mean, I've read a lot of literature from quite ancient times, and there is this idea that men are superior in a very funny way. And the joke when I was young was that was like Lee was describing. The man, in a sense, the husband, did all the important things, like decide who they're going to vote for, and the woman chose how they spent their money, where they ate, where they sent their kids to school, and where they went on vacation, and where they went to church. And that was a joke that was really common in comedy in 20th century popular literature.
There was a good cartoon about that in the New Yorker once. My husband decides all the important things like foreign policy. I decide all the little things like where we're going to live and what we're going to eat and where we're going to go.
There it is. Yeah. There's the joke. Yeah. And that's
I think you're right that there's been some category tension all along, but it's been institutionalized now with feminism and with policies that they've advocated, and they now have not continued to engage in the back and forth, but they flipped the hierarchy and now insist on taking command and being in charge. I've talked to numerous people, including people in journalism, said, if you're a white male, good luck trying to find a job. And I think it's probably true. If you look at who's hired these days, that there's a great deal of discrimination against men, and particularly discrimination against white men. There is, of course, in feminism, a very explicit demeaning of men. There's the whole campaign of of masculinity is toxic. Men are poisonous. This becomes a theme in public communication, and any male who said that would likely be taken to court or thrown out of his job or be in serious trouble. But feminists have no problem demeaning men. Girls walk around proudly with a T-shirt saying "the future is female."
Is that possible? Here's a quote from Camille Paglia. If civilization had been left in female hands, we would still be living in grass huts. Needless to say, she's not revered by feminists, although she calls herself a feminist, but still, she's a dissident feminist. Do feminists recognize the male contribution to society, the dirty work that so many men do?
No, of course not.
And why do you think that is?
Okay, look, it's not something that is emphasized by females. Females, they want to emphasize other things. For example, I was very impressed that my anthropology students at McGill, most of whom were female, look at me, I may be the last male anthropologist you'll ever see, because females have entirely taken over the profession. My female anthropology students asserted quite certainly that we at the university in North America, in the West, had a rape culture. Now, you might think that anthropology students would know what a culture is, but they didn't seem to quite grasp it. A culture is a set of understandings that children are taught and socialized into. They're a set of values that people are rewarded for following and punished for countering. Now, the reality in our society is quite clear. We do have various kinds of, if you talk about parts of the culture, we have a reading culture. We teach people to read. We reward people to read. We make it a step toward advancement, and we regard it highly. We do not teach people to rape. We do not reward people for raping. We do punish people for raping. We do not say raping is a good thing. It simply is not a culture. Yes, some rapes happen, but car accidents happen too. Do we have a car crash culture? Do we teach people how to crash cars? Do we reward people for crashing cars, or do
Well,
we
hold on now. That's toxic masculinity too, right? Aren't a lot of those accidents caused by aggressive males hopped up on testosterone?
But we don't teach them to do that. We don't encourage them to do that. We don't reward them for doing that. That's
true.
what you do. That's what a culture does. And so the idea that we have a rape culture is contrary to any idea of what culture is or any fact about the society. But it's important for fourth wave feminism because they were losing support because of earlier achievements. How to keep females back on the farm. How to keep them part of the huddling among the group of female extremists by frightening them and saying that there's a rape culture. Every time you go outside the door, you're going to be raped. And by redefining rape, if you have a consensual relationship and then regret it later, that was really rape. They define it so that it can include almost anything.
Now, I think that there is kind of a rape culture in America. I don't know if about elsewhere, but maybe not in Canada. But it's not about women. It's about men, and it's about men in prison. Because I've heard men and women at every level of society joke about if you're sent to prison, you will be raped by some big black guy. This is a very common joke in America. And it seems kind of like an acculturation. What?
Very funny.
Yeah, well, it's kind of horrific in its own way too. I mean, it's an astounding thing, but it is the only pro-rape kind of thing I've heard in America, right? The people I hang out with don't want to rape women, and they don't like women being raped, and are concerned about it. I don't know if we talk about it properly, but men being raped in prison is something people joke about regularly in America.
I think it's probably not that men are being raped, it's that criminals are being raped. I think this is the sense that there's too much crime, that too few criminals get what they deserve, and when some do, that's something to celebrate.
So it's part of the punishment.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think that's an anti-male thing.
Okay.
That's just off the top of my head, but that's how I would respond.
Now, you did a lot of study in the Mideast, and right now, modern feminists seem to be very interested in Islam. They have a very strange pro-Islamic and pro-Muslim immigration perspective. Surely, your work in the Mideast, you have some ideas about this embrace of Islam, which does not strike me as a very pro-modern woman kind of place.
It's stunning. Intersectional wokeness contains all kinds of weird contradictions, of which that's one. Feminists never speak out against the oppression of women in the Middle East, the slavery in the Middle East, and when women are taken in the Middle East, they're always sex slaves. There is no real production in the Middle East, so there are no plantations. They can't put them on plantations. In fact, the slavery of the Middle East in Africa, they took 2 females for every male. When they got the males, they castrated them, and the women went into the harem or into the household and were to sexually serve the males of the family. That's the opposite ratio of the North Atlantic slave trade, for example.
Okay, and what period are you talking about here? Going back, is it this the Muslim period, or does this go back earlier? Is it more recent? What period are we talking about?
From I would say probably for the last 2,000 years, going up to yesterday and today.
Yeah, that's a bit harrowing.
Yeah, I mean it went on in the Sudan. It's been going on in the Sudan right up to today.
Is this just a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of thing in terms of the intersectional mathematics there?
I'm not quite sure. I mean, there are other contradictions, such as Black Lives Matter identifying with the Palestinians, who call Africans slave in Arabic. Abid is the word that's used for Africans. It means both black and slave. Mm-hmm. This intersectional wokeness is very interesting and doesn't make a lot of sense. But it is concerning that that feminists don't seem at all interested in the fate of women in the Middle East or India or other parts of the world. There's a lot to say about that, and they refuse.
Well, it's touching a third rail, isn't it? It's easier to beat up on white men, wouldn't you say?
Well, there's the intersectional thing. Those people are alleged to be people of color, although Arabs and Persians are classified as white in the American census system and do not regard themselves in the same class as Africans or darker people. Even in India, the fairer northerners look down on the darker southerners, and the complexion is a big factor in marriage negotiations.
Yeah, racism is everywhere, but it seems like many people think it was spawned by whites exclusively, which is very odd.
Yeah, there's most wokeness seems to believe that history began in the year 2000 and know nothing about what's happened previously or in the rest of the world. The ignorance is incredible. But also the unreality. Let me give you an example of that we can thank feminists for. How about the idea, believe women? Believe women. Whatever women say, we should believe. If women make accusations, we should believe them without considering anything else. This is truly remarkable. There is a hidden clause there, and that is, unless the accusation is against one of our favorite political leaders, such as Justin Trudeau or Joe,
right,
against whom sexual assault accusations have been made and been totally disregarded. But otherwise, women should always be believed. Now, anybody who says that is very far from reality, since anybody with any grasp of reality knows that most people lie some of the time and some people lie all of the time. Furthermore, this has come up in particular in regard to female accusations of male sexual assault and rape and so on. And yet we have reams of cases of accusation having proven to be false. I've documented this in some of my articles, but it's that information is very readily available. Let me give you just one example. the famous Mattress Girl of Columbia University. Mattress Girl was an undergraduate, and she had casual sex with a German visiting student. I guess he wasn't a visiting student. I guess he was a German who was also an undergraduate, but he was a foreign national. They had a casual relationship. She liked him better than he liked her. She sent him a whole series of emails demanding more attention and more of a relationship. He basically tried to cool it. And then she accused him of raping her, anally raping her, just to give it a little more flavor. And this went to the Title IX committee, who had to do the evaluation. And although most Title IX committees are controlled by radical feminists and always assume that the female is telling the truth and is correct, and 99% of the cases they judge the male guilty, usually not telling him exactly what the accusation was, or letting him present any evidence, or letting him present witnesses. In this Columbia case was exceptional because they looked at the case and they looked at the evidence and they said, yeah, no, he didn't do it. So Mattress Girl was not happy with that result. And so she carried a mattress around campus from her class to class. She became famous. He became not well looked at. They even let her carry a mattress up on stage at convocation, if you can believe that. And then the National Organization of Women gave her their annual award, even though the committee had dismissed her claim. In fact, this student, after he graduated, he was so angry, he sued Columbia, went to court and said this incident and the way Columbia handled it ruined my experience of college. And he received a large settlement.
I hope so.
So, and that's happened, in fact, across the board. There are innumerable cases where men judged guilty in these railroading, feminist railroading, Title IX committees would go to court, to an actual legal court, and the court would rebuke the university for not following standards of justice, demand that they put in protections, in some cases give settlements to the students. There are many, many, many cases like that.
Right.
The courts may be the last place in the country that some justice can be found. It's not found in universities. It's not found in Congress. It's not found in businesses these days. We're a step away from wokeitopia.
Well, that leads to my last question, which goes back to something Timo was talking about earlier, which was male feminists. I mean, isn't a simple fact that the only reason all of this goes on is because men allow it to go on, in a sense? I don't mean that just that we can use our superior strength and just overwhelm all these institutions, but it seems like that must be well, of course, women allow it to go on too. But it just seems odd that it goes on at all, given how terrible it is.
Well, look, men are subject to ideology as women, and men have imbibed Marxism, wokeness, diversity, inclusion, and all of that in universities. And to them, that's the new morality. That's the right thing to do. And of course, it doesn't hurt that if you do the right thing and take the right positions, a lot of woke college students and college graduates on the female side will find you interesting.
You hope so.
part of men's bowing to this ideology is the old sexual competition with other males for female acceptance.
I've been rewatching Buffy the Vampire Slayer recently. And this is about a very attractive young woman doing impossible things, kicking men around. That is vampires in this case, but she's stronger than anyone has a right to be, considering her figure. And this is just fun to watch. I mean, I have to admit, it's a fun show to watch, and it's well written and all that. But there's a lot of female heroes in the culture, and they keep on promoting them. And it seems like that this is partly a male fantasy of a strong woman who doesn't behave like most women. It's a very small number of women who are very, very, very strong and athletic and could kick men's ass. And even then, female sports stars generally cannot outperform men. In direct competition with men, they fail miserably. So to what extent is this just a fantasy?
Those fantasy stars are all beautiful and stacked.
Yes.
So yes, they are looking to a male audience as well as a female audience. But again, I think the evidence shows that you're right, that females are being presented doing things that in fact they can't do. And we see that in practice with trans females competing against girls in athletic events and winning all of the girls' events, simply because men are physically different from women. That's the way it is. Something that, but feminists want to make the case that women are equal and superior to men in all respects, even physically, even though it's obviously false.
Yeah, it's interesting that they want to dispense with men, but if they have any concept of reality in line with what you were just saying, they realize that men, until robots can do everything that men can do, in terms of maintaining a robust civilization, never mind, reproducing, you do need men around to do all the dirty work, the heavy lifting and so forth, in order to maintain the civilization. So it's odd that they want to promote this idea of superwomen, in a sense, given that they don't yet exist. Maybe they could be engineered into existence, I don't know, in the long term, but it just seems rather odd.
Well, these superwomen help to justify the subordination of men in their framework. Women don't really want to get rid of men; they just want to subordinate them and have them under their control and work for them, so they can benefit from their work.
I guess we should say some women want to do this, because most of them probably do not.
Feminists.
Right.
Yes.
The anti-feminists.
No, there are a lot. Yes, of course. There are a lot of women who are not feminists and who object to this. There's another aspect of feminism that we haven't talked about that is perhaps worth mentioning, and that is that one of their highest values seems to be killing their own babies. In America, almost approaching 1 million babies are killed in the womb every year. That seems to me, and this is something that feminists are vehement about. It's their number one demand that they be free to kill their babies, even after they're born. And this seems to me an indication that not only do they not care about men and are happy to see men not only subordinated but degraded, but they feel the same about women. They don't think about anybody but themselves. And I think that's a very corrupt ideology.
I guess we'll close it out there because we're at the 1 hour mark. So
Yep.
Thank you so much for joining the LocoFoco podcast, Philip Salzman.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This has been very interesting, and if you ever feel like talking some more about the subject, I'm sure I'd be interested in asking you more questions.
Or any subject, for that matter. We would love to have you.
I'll be happy to talk with you about universities anytime.
Okay, very good.
We'd love that. Thank
Thanks.
you again, Philip.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.
And thank you, the listeners and viewers of the LocoFoco Netcast, for joining Lee Waaks and me as we explore the world of ideas and freedom. My name is Timothy Virkkala. You can find me at workman.com and at Workman on social media. That's Workman with an I, not an O. And you can find this podcast at locofoco.net. Communicate with the team at locofoco.us, and perhaps join our fledgling community at locofoco.locals.com. Thank you.